Hey guys, just a quick heads up on these because I started recording before we had gone over the quiz, and I realized that most of the time the quiz terms are more or less verbatim from the vocab terms. That's often the case, but this week it will not be like that. So they will still be like correct, you'll get the gist of them correct. If you study the vocab, it just won't be a word for word definition, which I think, we're critical thinkers. We can probably still survive otherwise. Maybe this is a longer chapter. I don't know. This one has 20 terms in it. I think a little bit more. I think it has like 23 terms. So let's get into this chapter. So this entire chapter is framing the effects of the Cold War, which I can quickly go back to the gist for you guys. So the first kind of point of the Cold War and the kind of the inflection point when the relations between the Soviet Union and the non-communist countries of Europe begin to deteriorate is in their joint occupation of Germany. So I think the ultimate, goal was to occupy Germany until it could stabilize and the powers of the world could determine that Germany could be trusted to become independent. However, as the relations dissolve between communist and non-communist nations, Germany becomes this a front in this conflict, and mainly in the city of Berlin, which, because it's the capital of Germany, it was also agreed to through Yalta and Potsdam to be jointly occupied. But how Berlin is in eastern Germany, so you have all of Germany. West Germany is occupied by the Allies. East Germany is occupied by the Soviets, and then inside of East Germany, you have also have Berlin that is also split up among the Allies and the Soviet Union. The Soviets sought to take control of all of Germany when they blockaded Germany in the 50s. The idea being, if you can cut off West Berlin from supply lines and starve them out, the Soviets would have control of all of Berlin then, and that point of tension would be resolved. However, Western nations, led by the U.S., engage in a pretty immense effort to supply West Berlin through an event called the Berlin Airlift, where supplies are dropped into West Berlin over a rather long period of time. So, I want to say over a year. West Berlin is supplied almost exclusively through airdrop. And because, Berlin is not, it was a massive, logistical effort to do that. And because they could not starve out West Berlin, eventually they end the blockade. But that doesn't mean that Soviet aspiration of controlling Berlin does not change. And as time progresses, the two occupied parts of Germany begin to diverge from one another, where the Allied occupied Germany and the Soviet occupied Germany have different stories. West Germany receives aid through the Marshall Plan. Its economy is integrated into the capitalist, democratic paradigm, where the Soviets, in many ways, because they wanted to punish Germany for how it had treated the Soviet Union during World War II, but also because of other priorities, East Germany is not invested into as extensively as West Germany is. But nonetheless, East Germany becomes a communist satellite as a consequence of World War, of the occupation. After the airlift is resolved and the blockade ends, West Berlin is this very attractive opportunity for East Berliners and East Germans who are not happy with the consequences of the Soviet occupation. So many flee to West Berlin, hoping for protection. And this leads to the construction of the Berlin Wall, which was a wall that split Berlin in half, but also because, outside of Berlin was, Soviet occupied and then East German occupied territory, getting into East Berlin also was difficult from outside of Berlin itself. But because some Germans were unhappy, or Germans were unhappy with the occupation by the Soviets, that led to more people fleeing there. The Soviets didn't want that anymore, so they build the wall. And the fall of that wall in Eastern Germany is often symbolic as of the end of the Cold War, though it kind of like ends a little bit before that in a way, and stuff like that. The other effect is this massive geopolitical like solidification that occurs in geopolitics. These massive alliance systems develop, namely NATO and the Warsaw Pact. So Western and Europe and America formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, known as NATO. That is a defensive pact. You guys probably, if you follow current events, heard a lot about NATO last year when Russia invaded Ukraine, because Ukraine was considering joining NATO, and because of the defensive pact, and Ukraine had been in a protracted conflict with Russia over the past decade after they invaded in 2012. Russian concerns was that if Ukraine were to join NATO, they could construe an attack on Ukraine from Russia and then call in all of NATO to attack Russia, right? That was Russia's concern. But Ukraine has not joined NATO still, though NATO is supplying and supporting Ukraine during that conflict. But NATO is chiefly guided by the intent to stop the spread of communism and stop the threat of communism to the nations that are members of NATO. After NATO, the Soviet Union coordinates an alliance system among its satellite states known as the Warsaw Pact, which was a defensive alliance as well. So if a member of the Warsaw Pact is attacked, that would trigger a defensive call to arms, and all the nations would come to protect Poland or the Soviet Union or oh my God, I'm trying to think of like other ones, more concrete examples. Romania, I think. This also could be known as the communist bloc, without a K. It's like a French word, so geopolitics in French all the time. Not every country joined the Warsaw Pact, though. And something you guys want to be aware of, especially when we talk about for AV World, are these kind of exceptions. So Yugoslavia and what AMSCO reports as Albania are countries that don't join the Warsaw Pact. In addition to these larger treaty organizations, we also have examples of other ones in other regions of the world. So CETO is an alliance organization guided by American interests to stop the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. And CENTO is the Central Treaty Organization, who had the goal of protecting the Middle East from the spread of communism. So these treaty organizations are more about the spread of communism, but they're these defensive alliances. A lot of the time we're going to spend on this chapter are on the subtopic titled Proxy Wars. So there are like 6 of them we got to talk about. And so the first one we got to talk about is the Korean conflict. So remember, Korea was controlled by the Japanese during World War II. After World War II, Korea is going to become independent, but it's joint occupied by the Soviets and the Americans. That should be a theme that you're identifying, that this joint occupation thing leads to tension points. The North that's occupied by the Soviets becomes communist. The South becomes non-communist, depending on who you ask. But I think the general historically accepted explanation of events is that the North attacks the South, almost conquers the entirety of the South. The United Nations intervenes to try and calm down conflicts. The Security Council votes, and because the Soviets aren't present in the Security Council, that vote passes to have the UN directly intervene in this civil conflict in Korea. The UN shows up. A World War II general you learned about a few chapters ago, Douglas MacArthur, is the leader of the UN forces in Korea. Eventually, the UN forces are successful. They push the North Koreans pretty far into northern Korea, which eventually motivates an intervention from Communist China, the People's Republic of China, which then pushes the Allies back. They kind of meet in the middle of Korea. They don't make progress one way or the other, which leads to a stalemate. And eventually, to this day, there's a ceasefire between South and North Korea, not a peace. So they're actually still at war with one another. They just don't try to kill each other all the time. Sometimes they do, though. Sometimes they do. In Vietnam, Amsco's really messy with this. So there are two Vietnamese conflicts we have to talk about. The first Indo-Chinese War is when the Vietnamese, led by the communist nationalist leader Ho Chi Minh, successfully defeat the French in 1954 and kick the French out of Indochina and make Vietnam an independent country. However, as a consequence of that treaty that gave Vietnam its independence, two Vietnams were created. Oh my God, they're partitioning again. North Vietnam was held by the Vietnamese Communist Party, led by Ho Chi Minh. South Vietnam was an area that was more invested in French colonialism in many ways, and was not directly under the administration of the Vietnamese Communist Party. But what Vietnam wanted to be unified, where North Vietnam wanted to connect with the South Vietnamese, and so they sponsor a guerrilla conflict, a guerrilla force inside of South Vietnam, in addition to wanting to take control of South Vietnam as well. And after a period of time, the U.S. slowly escalates their involvement in Vietnam to try and protect this non-communist nation, because the fear is that if Vietnam becomes communist, the neighboring nations like Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, Burma, then Myanmar would become communist. The greatest irony is that even during this conflict, this 15-year conflict where America is in Vietnam, what do you know? Laos and Cambodia both become communist as a consequence of American actions in many ways during the war. And then Johnson's the leader who escalates the involvement in Vietnam. You'll learn about Vietnam from the American perspective next year, and its immense impacts on American politics after. To go a little bit backwards in time, we have to talk about the Bay of Pigs crisis. So last time we talked about Cuba, Cuba had become a independent but protectorate of the United States, which means that American business interests were very involved in the economic and political development of Cuba. What that meant is that, this kind of laissez-faire capitalism run rampant, deeply disenfranchised the people of Cuba to the point where they wanted to overthrow the pro-American government in Cuba and install a nationalistic communistic government in Cuba. And they eventually do, led by a man named Fidel Castro. When Castro comes to power, he nationalizes all these American businesses, which definitely upsets the American businesses. So America tries to overthrow Castro by training Cuban exiles in America to invade Cuba, start a revolution against Castro, and they start in this area called the Bay of Pigs. It is a poorly planned, poorly executed, and unrealistic project, which ultimately fails almost the moment it is implemented. So the Bay of Pigs crisis is an attempted military overthrow, so it's a conflict, but it's not like the American is directly sending stuff to directly sending soldiers to Cuba, but training Cubans to overthrow the Cuban government. But it fails spectacularly. It's one of the greatest failures of America during the Cold War. The next proxy conflict still involves Cuba, and it's the missile crisis. So a big point of contention for the Soviet Union during the 50s and 60s was the positioning of American nuclear weapons in Anatolia within the nation of Turkey, which is a member of NATO. So why this was so upsetting to the Soviets is that America is protected by the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. If someone were to try to attack America with nuclear weapons, America could actually be pretty well prepared for that. However, nuclear weapons in Turkey meant that if America chose to use nuclear weapons, they could use them more quickly than the Soviets could if they chose to do so. So the Soviets see an ally in Cuba because Cuba is communist. So they asked Cuba, can we station some of our nuclear weapons on your guys' island so that if we need to be attacked, we could attack, or if we want to attack America, we can attack as well, right? So it pretty much it's the Soviet Union trying to equalize the leverage that America has over the Soviet Union. When the U.S. finds out that there are nukes in Cuba, they are so not chill about that, and so they threaten to blockade Cuba and stop Cuba from getting more weapons or just being supported in general. It's not called a blockade. It's called something like an embargo, something that is not directly a blockade, because a blockade is an act of war. So because they didn't want to declare war on Cuba, but they were essentially doing it, and the Soviets chose not to interpret it as an act of war, because if they did, that would require them to take increased military action, which would escalate tensions, which would then lead to more military conflict, which then might lead to the deployment of nuclear weapons against your enemies, which would have led to the end of the world, right? So they don't get, they don't lead to war, not way, war. I'm having more and more typos, guys. I'm sorry. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, the inability of America and the Soviet Union to directly communicate with each other in times of crisis, it becomes immensely relevant to the stability of the planet and the existence of humanity. And so a hotline is installed. And in case of emergencies, American leaders could speak to Soviet leaders very quickly so that they could not deal with the mystery of events like the Cuban Missile Crisis. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, there's a pretty significant shift between Soviet and American conflict. Namely, that both countries had kind of seen how bad it could get, and were now looking for ways to decrease tensions. And the world was looking for ways to decrease tensions. And so efforts like the Test Ban Treaty, which essentially banned the testing of nuclear weapons, which was often a very agitating event in global politics, because why would you test a thing unless you intended to use that thing against your enemy, right? So whenever you deployed a nuclear weapon, you blew up Bikini Atoll or something like that, that told your enemies, look what we can do, right? It was threatening. So the nations of the world agree to stop testing nuclear weapons, because all that did was escalate tensions. That's why it's so concerning every time North Korea does that every few years, because they're the only country in the world that is willing to consistently test nuclear weapons. In addition to the Test Ban Treaty, nations also sign agreements to end nuclear non-proliferation, or stop the spread of nuclear weapons, called non-proliferations. So, for example, again, what North Korea has done in the past 2 decades has developed nuclear weapons on their own, and in doing so have escalated tensions on the planet, because North Korea is a state that has an adversarial relationship with many other nations. Another country that has a hostile relationship with countries with nuclear weapons would be Iran. Though, depending on who you ask, Iran is still developing nuclear weapons or has stopped developing nuclear weapons. We'll talk about Iran, I think, in a second. But that is another big no-no of more countries having nukes presents more opportunities for nukes to be used, which means more opportunities for humanity to end itself, right? Now we're back to actual proxy wars, where Angola is a country that's ethnically diverse. That diversity is leveraged by the interest of the Cold War powers like the Soviet Union and the United States to advance their own interests. So the Soviets pick one ethnic group, kind of condition them to become communist. The Americans pick another group, condition them to become capitalist and democratic advocates, and they don't agree on what Angola should become. And so they fight a civil war with each other that's not resolved until the 21st century. So even after the Soviet Union is gone, Angola is still in a period of civil strife started by Cold War tensions. And our final proxy war is the Contra War, where the conservative government of Nicaragua is overthrown by left-leaning rebels. The American government is not happy about that, so they sponsor an anti-socialist group known as the Contras for a period of time, and they also funnel them weapons through very sus means, like through Iran, which is not. It was a big iffy and almost got Ronald Reagan impeached. So our final thing is the anti-nuclear weapon movement, which was just people are kind of like, nukes bad? And everyone's like, you know what? They kind of are. So civilians around the planet of kind of in a global sense come to understand that nuclear weapons are a greater threat than an asset to a nation, or some civilians do, right? Like, you can have your own opinion about nuclear weapons, but in response to the threat of nuclear weapons, civilians have advocated for the end of nuclear weapons, destroying them, like stop having them, get rid of the technology that enables the use of them, so that humanity does not have the potential to blow itself up in that way, right? We humans have so many ways we can wipe ourselves out, right? We don't need nukes for that. And that's what an anti-nuclear weapon advocate would say. So that is our third chapter for the week, which we have one more to do, and it's a fun one. It's about not the Cold War, but communism, be outside of the Soviet Union. So I'll see you guys in that video.